researcher working on Zcash. I spent about 9 years or so working at the electric coin company on snark research and development for Zcash. And late last year, I decided to leave ECC so that I could work on research independently with a focus on long-term things like scalability. I'm very interested in seeing how we can modify and deploy changes to Zcash that allow it to scale to a large number of users and to a large number of payments without compromising on the strong privacy guarantees that we provide. So that's what today's talk is about. I wanted to share some thoughts about some new directions I think we should take the scalability research that might hold some promise and maybe resolve some outstanding problems. So the talk will get a bit technical, and I'll probably lose some of you in the process, but it is what it is. So I'll just dive right into it. So how does Zcash work? Right now, shielded transactions consist mainly of a list of spend objects and output objects, along with some other components that make sure that the transaction is valid, like the ZK snark and stuff like that. I'll be omitting a bunch of details just to simplify things. So you open your wallet generates an address, and this address contains a public key and some other stuff, and you give it to someone so they can send you a shielded payment. And they create one of these shielded transactions that gets mined on the blockchain. And inside the shielded transactions outputs, there's a cryptographic commitment to a note. And the note contains some stuff, including a key that's linked to a secret key that you're authorized that authorizes you to spend the note, the value of the note, and so on. And it's a commitment, of course, so it's blinded, so it just appears to be random data. So in order to see if we received a note on chain, all of the note commitments in transactions are accompanied by a ciphertext, which is encrypted to somebody's payment address, and the plain text of this contains information about the note that the recipient needs in order to spend it, and it also contains a memo and some other stuff. So your wallet will go through the blockchain and attempt to decrypt every single one of these ciphertexts to see if any of the notes are for you so that you can spend them. Now, if you do receive a note, your wallet collects some evidence that the note exists and that it's spendable. And I'll call this evidence a witness, for lack of a better word. And this witness information can later be used to show, This witness information can be used to show that in the future, if we want to spend that note, we can show that a note existed in a block. And so we prove knowledge of this witness with the ZK snark, and the snark reveals some information about the point in history of the blockchain that our witness is for. And we actually call that an anchor. Of course, as the blockchain has more payments in it, we don't want to use the old witness for the old anchor, because as new notes are added to the chain, when we actually go to spend our funds, we don't want to reveal that those new notes that were added to the chain weren't notes that we could have spent, because our witness is antiquated now. So we actually try our best to use new anchors before we do a spend. So in order to do this, we can take our witness and we can update it to account for all the new blocks that have appeared since we first received the note. And we can do this continuously, by the way. So we do that. And so the first part of this process that I mentioned already, where you learn about a note and you attain some initial evidence that it exists, that we can spend it, and so on. I refer to that as receiving the note. And then the second part, where you can continually try to keep up with the changes of the blockchain so that when you want to spend it later on, use the most recent information to do it, which we primarily do for privacy reasons, but also because consensus validators shouldn't be expected to remember all the history of the blockchain in order to validate new transactions. Anyway, it's mainly for privacy reasons, though. I call this second part syncing the note. And of course, syncing the witness to show that it exists in a blockchain, that the note exists, is really easy to do using all sorts of things, like, for example, a cryptographic accumulator like an append-only Merkle tree, which is actually what we use in Zcash. Of course, proving that we know of a note that is on chain in the past isn't sufficient, because we actually have to prove that that we haven't spent the note before, and so we do this. Otherwise, we would be double spending. So we do this with the use of a nullifier. Transactions reveal nullifiers inside of all the spend objects, And nullifiers are basically, from everyone else's perspective, they're just random bytes. But there's some deterministic function of the note that we're spending. And they act as sort of a fingerprint that's forcibly revealed when we go to spend our note. But nobody else learns anything about the note we're spending because it's just basically randomness. So the validators on the network will look at all the transactions that take place, and they'll reject transactions that reveal a nullifier that they've seen before in a previous transaction that they've accepted, since that would suggest that a previous transaction already spent the note. So this would be a double spend. But if we haven't seen that nullifier yet, if we choose to accept the transaction, the validators write the nullifier down so that future transactions are prohibited from spending that note again. So the two scaling challenges in Zcash revolve around these nullifiers and the note receiving problem. And I'm not going to focus too much on the note receiving problem because I think basically anyone who's looked at it understands what we need to do to resolve it. And there's a lot of different options to resolve it. I have a slide here just to briefly kind of go over that, but I'm not going to go in too much detail. Basically, the gist of it is all in-band secret distribution needs to be removed from Zcash in the future. You need to learn about your notes out of band potentially through the use of a pre-existing channel that you have with the sender of a payment. And you have to collect your witness for the notes that end up on chain using a process that doesn't involve decrypting every ciphertext that ends up on chain. That's just not scalable. It's really the only approach we have. I'm not going to focus too much on this part of the problem. That could be its own talk, really. I'm going to focus entirely on a much more daunting challenge that's kind of haven't made much progress on, which is scaling the nullifiers and how that might relate to the problem of syncing our nodes. So nullifiers don't scale in the existing protocol because validators have to keep a record of every single nullifier that's ever been seen before, so they can prevent new transactions from revealing the same nullifier. And even in some of the ideas that I've seen for how to scale Zcash have been sketched out in the past, validators still have to collectively keep these records as they grow forever, even if some of these validators can get away with only storing a subset of them under some conditions. In general, this set still needs to be maintained by the validators. So the state of the art in dealing with this problem, which Dara Hopwood talks about in their ZK Proof Amsterdam presentation about the subject, basically involves sharding the space of possible nullifiers. At the consensus layer, transactions are forced to deal exclusively with nullifiers that are in that subspace assigned to that shard, and then validators in that subspace, they still have to keep track of all the nullifiers that have been revealed in it. They still have to process the transactions that take place in that shard, and they also have to use this special kind of sparse binary Merkle tree accumulator thing in order to check and update a shared database of nullifiers that have been recorded in previous transactions in that shard, so they can reject double spends, but also so they can prove to other validators, including the ones that aren't part of that shard, that they have been following the rules and they haven't been allowing double spends. So this protocol is cool, and although it does improve some things, it doesn't solve the problem of validators having to keep the whole entire nullifier history recorded, which is a huge drawback. And it also makes the problem even worse because now they have to continually prove updates to arbitrary locations of a shared cryptographic object that records the nullifiers. And so there's availability problems, which always comes in with the territory when it comes to sharding. You can't just solve availability problems by throwing more shards at the problem. It always makes availability problems worse and increases risks and makes these other problems worse as you do that. And further, because transactions can only contain nullifiers within a single shard, wallets have to cajole their spendable notes sort of so that the notes have nullifiers that happen to appear in common shards. That way you can make transactions in those shards for payments in general. And it's really annoying that or you have to do cross-shard synchronization and communication, all this other stuff. It adds latency and complexity, and we haven't made much progress in scalability in this direction because it just seems so daunting to me anyway. So I wanted to avoid all that. So I did the natural thing and considered what would happen if users provided proofs that their nullifiers haven't been spent, and include these proofs in their transactions. In much the same way that we maintain a witness that proves knowledge of a node existing, like a set inclusion proof, we could also maintain a witness that a nullifier hasn't been seen before. And that way, as shielded notes are spent by other users and more nullifiers appear on chain, you can just continually update those witnesses to demonstrate that the new nullifiers that appeared on chain since then are also different from the wallet's own nullifiers, which proves that we haven't spent our note yet. And so when we want to spend our notes, we prove that we have a witness for a note in the chain, just as before, just as we do now. But then we also, in addition to that, in addition to revealing the nullifier, which we also do now, of course, we start to prove that the nullifier hasn't been revealed before. And the validators check this proof, and if they're satisfied, they can publish the transaction in the next block. They just have to check to make sure that none of the transactions that are being added in the next block have the same nullifier as some other transaction in that same block, because that would be a double spend as well. So as long as they do that, then everything's fine. And by recording the transaction in the block, or specifically the nullifier for all the transactions in that block, they leave a record of the nullifier, which prevents the wallet from continuing to maintain a witness for their note, because it's been spent already. So this has been thought of before. I'm not claiming this is not a novel idea or anything like that, but it has some problems, and there's some reasons that we haven't gone down this route before. So for one, users' wallets have to obtain a witness for the nullifier non-membership proof thing for the entire chain's history in order to demonstrate that that nullifier hasn't been seen before, which would suggest that the entire history is somehow available to the user, or the user can somehow create or obtain this set non-inclusion witness when they initially receive their note. And then the other problem is that as new shielded transactions appear on chain, so there's new nullifiers, the user's wallet has to continually update their witness, their set non-inclusion witness, to prove that the nullifier isn't revealed by any of those new nullifiers, so that later on they can use the updated witness in order to spend their notes. So they have to drink from the fire hose of the blockchain, so to speak. So I'm going to take a quick detour and introduce an important concept called an oblivious syncing service. That's what I call it. So the idea is that there's some service, you don't have to trust this service. Your communications aren't privileged at all. You never send any private information to this service. You'll use a mixnet to talk to it or whatever, but other than that, you might as well, all of your communication with this service could be made public, and it would have no effect on your privacy. So the goal is to give our shielded note witnesses to this service, or to multiple services maybe like this. And these services do the hard work of syncing our notes. In other words, they update our witnesses to account for the new transactions that appear on chain. And we can use the updated witnesses that it gives back to us to create transactions that spend our notes. And I'd like to point out that we have something already, if you squint a little, that can be crudely thought of as an oblivious syncing service right now, and that's LightWalletD. So right now, when you open your Zashi wallet or whatever, it asks LightWalletD server for some information, and then LightWalletD is responsible for performing some computations to help you sync your notes and update your witnesses to the latest version of the blockchain to account for all the transactions that have happened. And right now, it does this specifically for our note commitment witnesses. Actually, LightWalletD has Zcash and ZebraD do this on its behalf, but in principle, it's LightWalletD's responsibility to perform computations that help the user's wallet sync up their witnesses. And so right now, LightWalletD only helps you do this for your note witnesses, and not for anything else in the protocol that has to do with like nullifier non-inclusion proofs. We don't have anything in the protocol for that right now. But in theory, you could give the server some recursive snark that proves non-inclusion of a nullifier up to a certain block height. And then that server could expand on that proof to produce a new proof that covers the more recent blocks and hand that back to you. And you can use that to spend your notes. So the service wouldn't find out that you used the proof, by the way, because you could re-randomize it, the proof that they gave you. Because you can re-randomize it, or you can compose it with your snark. So there are a couple problems with this approach as well. The first problem is that Well, I mean, it's the same problem. We still have to prove non-membership of a nullifier or for the entire history of the chain, which would mean that these oblivious syncing services would have to maintain and process requests over the entire history of the previous nullifiers, which is part of the problem that we're actually setting out to solve, trying to solve that. But strictly speaking, it's actually a stronger requirement than is necessary, right? If we loosen our requirements of nullifiers by only requiring that a nullifier doesn't appear in any of the blocks after our note was included in a block, in the Merkle tree or whatever, it was after our note was mined, or shielded transaction that created the note was mined. As long as the nullifier didn't appear after that in any blocks, that's sufficient to capture the cases where we could double spend. Um, so, uh, in fact, with this recursive proof that you hand to this oblivious syncing service, you don't even have to reveal to the service the range of the lower bound of the range of the blocks that the non-inclusion proof covers, so that they don't see when you began syncing, because you can keep that as an encrypted base case for the recursive proof. There is another problem though, a privacy problem. So the service might not know when you started syncing the nullifier, and we might be able to hide that from them. But once we reveal the nullifier to the service, because they need it in order to check this non-inclusion proof, or to extend this non-inclusion proof for new blocks, if we send that nullifier to the service, and then a week later, a month later, a year later, we spend the note and then reveal that nullifier on chain, then the service learns that all the notes that appear, new notes that appeared on chain ever since I gave you the nullifier, or gave the service the nullifier, none of those notes were spent by that nullifier, which violates indistinguishability. And the reason why this happens is because nullifiers currently are computed using information that is, for the most part, unpredictable prior to the creation of the note. For example, like the note commitment, which and a bunch of other data that can't be anticipated, basically. Um, so we need some way to generate our nullifiers well in advance of the note, even the notes that they represent the spend of, so that revealing a nullifier before we actually spend it, no matter how early on we do it, to this oblivious syncing service, or even just posting it on social media or something, it doesn't reveal anything private about the note, that others wouldn't already figure out when they see the nullifier later on when you spend it. So here's some suggestions for how we could do that with nullifiers. These are kind of provocative suggestions, but I think that is fine. So if we look at how nullifiers are computed in Orchard, for example, and this kind of oversimplifies it, but we can see that the nullifier computation takes as input the note commitment for the note that we're spending, and another value, which is basically the nullifier, this row value, it's the nullifier of one of the spends in the transaction that originally created the note that we're spending. And the reason this computation takes the note commitment that we're spending as input is kind of a technical detail. It's completely avoidable. We just did it because it was cheap and it made the nullifier more robust against certain kinds of attacks. But so we don't really need to use it, but or we can avoid it. However, the reason why we take this row value in as an input is because we're trying to preserve this property that our nullifiers for all the notes that are created are unique from one another in the blockchain. And because we enforce, or we do in the current Zcash, we enforce that nullifiers are guaranteed to have never appeared before ever in the history of the blockchain, then we can use them as this sort of cheap way to guarantee that for new nullifiers, by feeding it into this derivation for the nullifier, that the new nullifiers, even if we're spending a dummy node or something, that it's not that it's not actually required to exist, that the dummy node's not required to exist in the chain. But even if we're doing that, the new nullifier is unique. So if you remember, though, we're trying to avoid needing to create proofs of non-membership for nullifiers for the entire history of the chain. So we don't have that history. We can't expect anyone else to retain it for us, much less produce non-membership proofs for us. There might be some other ways to force the nullifier to be unique, like with randomness beacons or whatever. But remember, we're trying to make it so that the nullifiers are predictable, so that revealing them prior to them appearing on chain doesn't compromise your privacy. So this suggests that maybe we need to ditch the requirement that nullifiers need to be unique at all. Um, the only reason we need them to be unique in the first place is to prevent this attack called a fairy gold attack, where your adversary sends you multiple shielded notes that they might not know what nullifier they end up being, but they'll be able to know that when you spend one of them, it'll reveal the same nullifier that the other one had. They have the same nullifier, so you can only spend one of them, not both, for example. Um, but with the changes that we're expected to make to the way that notes are received, and in general, just we don't care about this attack anymore. So, for example, in liberated payments, if I get a liberated, and this gets into the details of receiving notes and stuff, and I don't want to go too much detail. But if you're familiar with liberated payments, the sender gives you a key, an ephemeral key that you can use to claim the funds, or they could take the funds back, and the transaction's effectively canceled. So in that case, they can rug pull you anyway. So what would they gain from doing a fairy gold attack on you in that context? In other contexts, the recipient could, in other kinds of payment flows, the recipient can actually impose upon the sender what the note contents are, so they can prevent this attack from happening at all. So we can always mitigate or avoid fairy gold attacks, I think. So I don't think that's a big deal that we could change the protocol to make it so that nullifiers aren't forced to be unique. So if we remove these components to the nullifier computation, the resulting nullifier can be computed in advance of the creation of a shielded note. We don't have to know anything about the note before we create the nullifiers. And so what happens is, on startup, our wallet generates a bunch of nullifiers, and it starts building non-inclusion witnesses for them on chain, just empty non-inclusion witnesses. It doesn't have to do any syncing or anything like that. And the nullifiers it generate don't represent nullifiers for any the notes that exist yet. And we then ask an oblivious syncing service to start syncing these witnesses with the chain for us. And so the service might learn the nullifiers, which are made public eventually anyway when we spend the note that they're attached to in the future, but they don't learn where the node is that they're syncing the witnesses for, or even if a node exists on the chain for that nullifier, even yet in the chain. They also don't know, like I said before, that when the syncing of the witness actually began. So really, the oblivious syncing service doesn't learn anything, all without the use of homomorphic encryption, which is great. So what we end up with is that validating nodes don't need to maintain a history of the nullifiers that they've seen in the past. So they can just rely on the proofs that accompany the transactions that users post to ensure that the nullifiers haven't been revealed after the node commitment's been that's being spent appears on chain. And all validators have to do at this point is just make sure that they don't accept any transactions in a new block that try to double spend nullifiers within that same block, which is a way easier problem to solve. So there are a couple edge cases and outstanding maybe things that worth mentioning. For one thing, like if a user sends a transaction and their nullifier non-inclusion proof is for even the most recent block, but there are blocks that happen after that before their transaction gets mined, their non-inclusion proof becomes antiquated. So validators would need to add some wiggle room to this by updating the transaction without the original creator's assistance to further the set non-inclusion proof for the nullifier that's revealed, which they can do without, which they can absolutely do. It's just recursive proof. It also might just be simpler to have the validators keep track that you're validating for, that there's no duplicate nullifiers, and then you can use similar tricks to show that that hasn't happened for the last 10 blocks or so using just simple. I mean, I'm sure that it's just a crude idea I have where you just prove that polynomials that encode your nullifiers are square free. Very simple stuff. I'm sure there's something even better than that, but yeah, anyway. So there's a lot more that I wish I had time to talk about. I got to wrap this up, so I just wanted to mention a couple things before I stop. This new model introduces a ton of new ideas I don't think have been considered before. So for one thing, can nullifiers change over time before the notes are spent? Why would you want it to do this? Well, if you're familiar with the concept of a friendly fork, if there's a fork of Zcash and a deliberate fork, then if you try to spend today anyway, if you try to spend your notes that existed before that fork, you'll reveal the same nullifier on both the original chain and the fork. But you can impose changes on the way that nullifiers are computed at the fork point, for example, and the non-inclusion proof that you use to demonstrate that your nullifier wasn't seen before can switch from the old version to the new version of the fork at the fork point. So and you don't have to reveal what the old nullifier was. The non-inclusion proof does this for you. It's awesome. It only works, as far as I can tell, if the condition or the way in which the switching happens is a publicly enforceable thing or knowable thing. There might be some tricks that can make it so that you can do this at will. Of course, you could do it periodically, like every 1,000 blocks. You could make it so everyone's nullifiers change. I don't know why you do that, but it's some really cool things like that happen, and it's still secure, and it doesn't make it so that more information is revealed. So another thing is that I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood these oblivious syncing services. They can perform their service for many nullifiers, or even in like classes of nullifiers, in totally different ways, where they can make trade-offs in the time frames that they construct, that they sync for. They can do partial sets, or like they can do partial sets of the null or subspaces of the nullifier space. You can use, if you it's very flexible, because if you know the nullifiers you're looking at in advance, you can even do more things using batches of nullifiers that you're checking syncing for, using probabilistic, like sieves sort of. And you can switch between predicates arbitrarily as long as throughout this syncing process, as long as you can prove that the nullifier that you're checking doesn't exist, is caught by all the predicates that you switch between. So there's a lot going on here. So I just a couple more thoughts real quick while I have a couple seconds. Nullifiers and no commitments are starting to become simpler if we go down this route, and they're starting to also to be treated similarly. And this has been a trend in the protocol for years now, and many other people have thought of the same thing. They may just be special cases of the same cryptographic object. We can treat them the same way, so that whether or not they serve the purpose of a nullifier or a no commitment is opaque to the validators, for example. So maybe we can unify the two concepts. I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting. If you wanted to understand the idea for doing non-membership accumulators for nullifiers, and how that might work asymptotically, and why you wouldn't want to use, or what benefit you would have over using that over like a sparse binary Merkle tree accumulator for using set non-membership proofs and things like that. I've written this HackMD just a few minutes ago. I just kind of typed this up. That kind of takes that part of my talk out and just writes it out in the math, so that it's just a sketch, but you can understand where I'm coming from, basically. So that's basically it, and that was exactly 30 minutes. So that was a pretty good timing. If there's any questions, I have a couple minutes, but let's see. Okay, somebody asks, is there any strategy or plan as of yet to drive the scalability method or its development? Are there any known lessons from other projects? This is new to me personally. This is totally new. Like I've been thinking about it over the last few weeks. So it's not, I have no idea if other people have independently discovered this technique, or it's not, I mean, it's a combination of different techniques and observations, but it's possible that other projects have been exploring this. We have a very unique position because we're trying to make our system scale and also stay private. So we have our own vantage point for how to approach that problem, which might lead us down, and very, very likely will lead us down paths that other teams that are trying to scale their projects are probably not even going to consider, because their projects don't have to deal with the privacy constraints that we do. So that's why I instinctively think that this is an interesting direction for Zcash specifically. Okay, so there's another question. How does the proposed approach affect transactions creation efficiency? At the creation time of a proof, it doesn't make it any less efficient, or any significantly more efficient or inefficient. So the wallet syncing service is doing all the hard part of proving this non-membership proof, and actually the non-membership proof is really cheap to create. So yeah, it's cheap to create at the end of the recursion is what I mean to say, but folding that into your transaction, you just grab it from the wallet syncing service and then use it just the way you would to create a transaction now. So I don't see it causing an increase in like shielded transaction creation time on a phone. If certainly if hardware wallets are incapable now of doing snarks for Zcash, then this isn't going to help. But for those hardware wallets that can, then this isn't going to hurt all that much. It doesn't increase your memory usage or anything like that either. That significantly anyway. So, cool. Those are all the questions I have seen. So I think I'll just call it there. I think. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that this was a useful talk, and that this idea will help others think about ways that Zcash can scale. So thank you very much.